If Democrats wanted to get rid of Joe Biden and replace him with someone else, how would they do it? It's a pretty tricky situation, especially when you consider all that's happening. If you were to get rid of a current president and tell him not to run for reelection, how would you do that and why? Joe Biden's health has obviously been a topic of discussion for a long period of time. Both Joe Biden and Trump are old, but as a matter of fact, and just watching in speech, Joe Biden is clearly not all mentally there. Now, there are some advantages to Joe Biden being as terrible at speaking as he is. It kind of makes you sympathize with him. In fact, it kind of makes it so that you can place all your problems on Joe Biden while his handlers get a free pass. That means that whoever's truly running the show, we can't identify. And for Joe Biden's handlers, that's actually pretty advantageous. However, that advantage is now becoming too much of a liability. You still need the president to be able to be cognizant. Joe Biden and nobody else still has to make speeches, even occasionally, even if from his basement. And even if from his basement, he is starting to fumble, things are starting to look bad. And polling is showing that even among Democrats, with quite a few Democrats saying that they would actually prefer him not to run for re-election. Now, here's where this gets complicated, because traditionally, Joe Biden could step down and there might be an open primary, but Democrats have a problem. It is known as RFK Jr. RFK Jr. has at least 20 to 30% of the current Democratic primary vote. And although there's no chance that he will beat Biden in a primary election, he becomes incredibly competitive if Biden were to step down, which means if you're gaming this out, you really need to figure out a way around RFK Jr. or a way to get rid of him. Now, there's multiple ways to get rid of RFK Jr. Multiple of those popular ways have already been tried on various relatives of his. And certainly, although I hope that doesn't happen, I'm sure that's an option for certain camps. But let's not go down that route. Let's think of something more ethical. What the Democrats could do is they could wait until the Democratic primary is over. After the Democratic primary is over and they have just a couple of months left before the general election, they could do a bait and switch. What would that look like? Well, no one wants Kamala Harris running either. So you essentially need to figure out a way to get Kamala Harris out of the picture, have Joe Biden appoint another vice president, and then have that new vice president alley-oop and run for the original election. That would most likely be the strategy. Get rid of Kamala, give her another position, figure out who, probably Gavin Newsom or Gretchen Whitmer, you want to be the new vice president, and then have Joe Biden step down. That would be the cleanest way to do it. You would avoid any kind of election interference, but you have to deal with personalities. Where do you place someone like Kamala? And what dirt do you have on people to shuffle all these things around? I won't be able to talk too much on the dirt, and we can think about that, but you need to keep it in mind. Most likely, the only way you get rid of a Kamala Harris is by giving her a Supreme Court seat, giving her a seat on the Supreme Court. That is certainly an option and certainly an enticing option, but there's a problem. It's currently filled. There's no current vacancies. Can Joe Biden just get rid of a current sitting Supreme Court justice? Well, Lyndon B. Johnson did. Lyndon Baines Johnson is a good example of how you can exert power, raw power, to get what you want, regardless of a government of checks and balances. Lyndon Baines Johnson is probably one of our dirtiest presidents and was known for always doing whatever is necessary to get what he wants. He ended up getting a few Supreme Court justice picks when he originally was meant to get 0. He did that in a variety of ways. One of those ways was just simply pressuring a newly appointed justice to step down and become the ambassador to the UN. That worked. But who knows what dirt he had on that Supreme Court justice. Another thing that he did was he found a current Supreme Court justice's son and appointed his son to be the Attorney General's office. stating that there would be a conflict of interest now between the Supreme Court justice and the Attorney General. That Supreme Court justice stepped down. All this is to say is the current liberal-leaning Supreme Court justices could be forced out by the current administration. Now, of course, there will be talks and convincing. People will try to get them to go on their own, but I'm sure there will be multiple threats, multiple pressure points on those Democratic-leaning Supreme Court justices to leave and step down for the greater good. Where politics gets complicated is just the nuance of individual incentives. No Supreme Court justice wants to just give up their position, especially the current ones. Sotomayor and Kagan are both relatively young. They could both live on the Supreme Court for at least another 2 decades. Both of them, both Sotomayor and Kagan, could be on the Supreme Court for another 2 decades. However, that doesn't mean that they don't care about their legacy. And given that most media is on the side of Biden, in my opinion, they could simply say, we are going to rewrite history in order to ensure that you are painted as the reason that a future Supreme Court is now majorly ruled by conservative justices, because that is the fear. The fear is that if a Republican wins the presidential nomination, that they will get more Supreme Court picks. Further, now's Democrats' only chance. The Senate does not look to be playing in their favor. And this might be the only time for at least another 2 election cycles that they have both a Democratic and a Democratic president and a Democratic Senate, which is what you need to appoint Supreme Court justices. So all this means is that for Democrats to truly get rid of Biden in the most clean way possible, and alley-oop the next chosen successor to Biden, would be to figure out a way to get Kamala Harris onto the Supreme Court, put in whoever the new vice president will be, and then have Joe Biden step down. Otherwise, they will have to face off against RFK Jr., which will be a very messy primary and will not look good for any parties involved, and have to deal with the ensuing chaos of the vacuum that Biden's position will leave. No one wants to see Kamala Harris step up as president, but she still might fight it, and she still might make people choose to have her run instead of Biden, even though she is viewed as unpopular. Those nuances are always up for debate, but what we want to look into is the potential strategies that they could employ to get what they want. That way, we are always prepared.